Hello everyone, today we talk about the 14th century heresies between Pauperism and social revolt. So on Schwerpunkt we dedicated, I would say, not an excessive amount of time to heresies during the Middle Ages, especially in the lower times. Kind of stopped to the 13th century, but we talked a bit deal about Pauperism and say better Pauperistic-Evangelical movements that were a bit of constant throughout, I can say, even the Middle Ages, but also through many other periods in Christian history, as if you really think about it, the essentials were always the same. I mean, this idea that this original tension of Christianity that actually split in different branches, of which Pauperism was only one, because and the idea of a Christ-like model of poverty and according behavior that was praised in at least in criticism, when not in opposition to the society at the time, politics and society at the time, and especially also against the riches, the good. And we have discussed this when looking at how essentially the church dealt with that. So it's full of videos in my Medieval Christianity playlist that you can go check out if you are interested. Today I would like to discuss instead about these later movements, if you want, as we have said many times in on Schwerpunkt, how the 14th century is a bit of watershed in medieval history. If you want to look at a drastic change, a dramatic fracture of some sort, do not really look at the early Middle Ages or the High Middle Ages, but at the 14th century, because that's where this huge society that had formed in previous centuries through a fast rise of the amount of the population and wealth, etc., at a certain point broke down. This occurred by itself even before the Black Death, although probably without the Black Death this would have been maybe absorbed, and there would have been some recession, but maybe not the big crack that we see there. And about this previous, let's say this pre-Black Death society, we noticed that the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements were indeed a part of its expression, as this society had basically emerged from a world that was drastically fragmented, politically speaking. It had a rather weak central authority and public authority. So these all these new spiritual movements had grown by a certain degree completely uncontrolled. And this is incidentally the same moment into which the Church is able, however, to give itself a sort of centralized direction. Possibly the Church of Rome at this point is most centralized, or at least definitely among the most centralized powers existing in Europe, and not only, and kind of managed to halt this this phenomenon, to basically check all the various movements by some measure, or naturally dealing also with the armed forces of carrying it out through the armed forces of the secular powers. France was chiefly the power that was more perfectly aligned with the Papacy at this time, in terms of mutual support and especially an anti-German function. And today we will see how partly with the movements of Segarelli and the Dulcinians this part was true. Well, with Segarelli maybe not, but definitely with the Dulcinians there was also some political and military dimension of this spiritual movements. And this process of stemming had gone in parallel with certain degree of absorption also of these movements, and this is how the mendicant orders were essentially born. The mendicant orders were nothing but Pauperistic-Evangelical movements that were seen fit from a orthodox point of view, and they were easily assimilated, at least easily in perspective. Then naturally there were several problems, especially given by the Franciscans, and especially the current of the spirituals that kind of lived on, also bringing some. And the problem was essentially, the church did this for various reasons. First of all, because these were pretty massive movements. So, and in their origins, actually, they were not even born in opposition to the Roman Church. I mean, there was a big deal of criticism towards the Roman Church, but the primacy of Peter in Saint Peter was kind of recognized. It was mostly the clergy that wasn't conceived fit, or at least it was considered heading into another direction, which naturally is all the more evident the more you realize what the papal monarchy was being about. And we're not taking sides here. I mean, here I actually understand both instances. I don't really what I hope is to give you the reasons why this occurred, not really. Then you can draw your conclusions from a say moral point of view by yourself. I am not here to do this really. Initially, part of these movements were in fact so spontaneous that they didn't have really a well-defined theological belief that could even be conceived in opposition towards the Roman Church. It was something really very political. It was a protest that was triggered not by religious problems mostly, but political and social problems. And let's be fair about this. Also because the Church, however, was involved heavily in political and military matters at this point. It was increasingly more powerful in this sense. But these movements in part were, however, still fine. And that's the reason why the Dominicans and the Franciscans kind of were integrated, because there was no way evidently to hold them. Yeah, we see the Franciscans also kind of gave some problems, but overall there was nothing so subversive about what we're doing, or what they were preaching. So that was an important precondition to be assessed by the by the Roman Church to allow these movements to go out there and get followers and etc. And by the way, they had a big success in this sense, especially in the cities. These evangelic Pauperistical movements were mostly spread into the urban classes, where the Saint Francis was the son of a very wealthy merchant, and part of this also derived indeed from the very quick enrichment of the Western society and the urban classes at that time, in a world that was otherwise extremely poor. So the contrast between all the amount of wealth and all, instead, even not just the same Christian morals, but also the traditional morals, was considered as unbearable by some. So this renunciation to wealth, etc., was sometimes very spontaneous. It wasn't even deriving from a strict criticism of. It was really looking at the Gospels and to many, to many phrases. For instance, the most important, naturally, is give back to Caesar what is of Caesar, and give back to God what is to God. And that passage of the Gospels is very interesting because it was actually translated in a bit of a different way. Today, by studying Hebrew and making a philological analysis, we we actually stress the restitution. The idea that what Caesar gave you is something you have to give it back because it kind of has nothing to do with you as a Christian. Not in a strictly material. It's obviously still metaphorical. So it implies, really, you can interpret it in many ways. But in the Middle Ages, it was mostly conceived, and also for a longer time, as a form of differentiation of how society had to work. That is essentially the church, that has to go alongside with the secular powers. And actually I keep interpreting it partly practically in this fashion, because there are also other passages in the Gospels that naturally stress the interference, let's say, of the secular power into the Christian affairs in part. In St. Mark, you have the expression mentioned that every kind of ruler that is out there has a sort of divine sanction, in the sense that even if it is a pagan, or if it is doing very bad things, it's not there for nothing, because it's still being put there by God. So this is, for instance, a radically different approach. This comes straight from Judaism, because the Jews were traditionally very mindful about the local governments for the sake of their own community, so that they had, and this was passed straight into Christianism, and it developed all the political theory in the West that indeed stresses the complementarity of the secular earthly authority to the Christian one, at least on earth, naturally, because the divine authority is unsurpassed. But the problem is what happens on the earth. But aside this, let's skip this part, because maybe it's too philosophical in some ways. But it's important really to stress how, in my opinion at least, when addressing these chapters, how not to make it a strictly religious thing. I mean, these evangelistic paperistical movements have a great big fault from a strictly historical point of view, that they're not well documented. So a big deal of what has been written about them was actually criticized from certain points of view that naturally were stressing at the time, hey, we are in the 14th century. From a religious point of view, okay, it's obvious. There was a papal monarchy out there. What else should they do? But not much. This shouldn't let us indulge it was merely a religious thing. It was definitely important from a religious point of view, but especially certain movements like the ones we will see here for the 14th century, so in a later time when the majority of these Pauperistic-Evangelical movements had been essentially either absorbed by the church or wiped out, literally, like the Cathars. In the previous centuries, were still something connected, were still something present and strong, actually, but in relative terms, but they also were intertwined with lots of other things. And when we, the most up-to-date historiography today stresses this continuously, because we realize from certain hints, from the reception also of these movements, that really there was something more that wasn't told. This is also kind of a mystery, if you really want to find mysteries instead of tormenting the poor Templars, about which so much rubbish is being written just for the sake of publishing some knowledge some novel. Think about these movements like the Dulcinians, or that really were these kind of meteorites that passed without particular consequences, but that the time they existed were extremely interconnected with the politics and the warfare of the time. Excuse me, I drink, and not knowing that much, I drink a little bit. excuse me. So you have to understand also in this period that these movements were kind of the great defeated of the time from a religious point of view, because there's also in here much to be written about it. I mean, how is that these heresies that were so massively spread toward around the 12th and the 13th century were eventually wiped out relatively easily? Well, there are naturally many factors. The building of the papal monarchy and of national monarchies really did play a thing. I mean, there were greater plans of social engineering at this time that could be carried out. But this doesn't really tell it all, because heresies have been I mean, let's be frank about this. There were certain heresies that really had a huge success. You know, even Christianism is nothing but a sect of Judaism, and if you take it from a Jewish perspective, that's an heresy, and it's an heresy that basically took over the world. So things could happen, and if you really look at the 12th century, especially, you realize that this time the church, by the way, was still building up its centralized structure. So it was a moment in which nothing was really still determined, and these heresies were massively spread. Really, they had a huge potential, theoretically speaking. So why did they die off? Well, the main criticism relative to this refers to a sort of initial spontaneity of such movements that were all born about that. I mean, I don't want to say something banal, but you can see even today in a moment in which especially the communication through the internet is very difficultly checkable, because it's literally exploding. It's a bit like in the 12th century, if you want. It's a moment where certain structures of control still have to be created. The internet today is getting kind of increasingly controlled, but still there is a lot of things that are out there that are produced and that cause problems, by the way, in many ways, and the law systems are sometimes also very slow at kind of keeping up with these threats. So it's a very effervescent movement, but you realize how certain fashions, how certain phenomena actually rise and die extremely quickly, rise and fade extremely quickly, and especially when they are purely emotionally driven. There was a big deal of emotion attached to these movements. Indeed, these were movements that looked at the masses of people that really were living in tough times. You don't have to underestimate also this factor. You know, it was much easier to be emotional in a world like that, with a much higher degree of mortality, of insecurity, of fear for the future. Also because whatever was your interpretation of the Gospels, more or less everybody believed at the time that the end of the world was something much closer to that we could expect, that they could expect, and they believed in it very seriously. And naturally the salvation of one's soul was arguably the greatest concern for Christians, and so it was easy to press certain buttons from a psychological point of view and kind of have an influence on these populations. But there was something transitory in many ways. I mean, in this sense, we're still here looking at the Church of Rome that already exists with this millenary tradition, and yeah, of course, the Christianity today is kind of split, at least in confessions. So eventually the crack did happen in the 16th century, but here in medieval times it was the church who actually managed to keep almost everything in check. So this initial spontaneity brought alongside with it extreme problems, including the fact that you have to organize the church in some fashion. I mean, if you look at the papal monarchy, and that was created naturally for the ambition of the bishops of Rome, etc., but in the local aristocracies that were the ones from which the cardinals and popes were elected, with huge interests, lots of money flowing, a lot of political military power involved. But it also answered a much greater... first of all, it could have never existed if there hadn't been a previous organization. If Rome, since the very centuries of Christianity, immediately rose to a point of reference for all the Christians, at least of the West, I mean of Western Europe, and it kind of wove very far, wide and deep international relations. Think about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. This is something that happens in theoretically what should be the darkest hour of the Middle Ages. Instead, you realize that at that time that there was so much coordination, was so much international interaction. The Church of Rome already had those ties, those bonds, and at this time, in the lower Middle Ages, you can argue that the papal monarchy was a response not just to the imperial interference into papal affairs, but also a way to counter these heresies, because they were really a problem. There could have been a moment to which the Church of Rome could have been taken over by such heresies, if you look at it, especially in the 12th century. So nobody could really predict what this thing could be like. So even structuring the church in this fashion which was also part of what was criticized by these movements that were against the ecclesiastical hierarchies, and they didn't want the church to be so powerful, so heretical, so involved into political affairs, etc. And in part they were right, naturally, because if you care about the church, naturally you don't want it to be corrupted, you don't want. But first of all, at that time, this is something I rarely say, but I often stress in my life, that at that time, the popes were not really behaving in a worse way that what all the other rulers were doing. I mean, corruption during ancient times, during medieval times, you can argue up to today, is always there. It's not something you can eliminate, and especially in the Middle Ages, and this was, I can't say legalized as such, but it was the normal practice of politics. So if you wanted to be such a heavily political institution like the church at that time, how couldn't you be corrupted? Because it's a sin, but from a Christian point of view, but it's still reality. These are still human beings. They're, so these Pauperistic-Evangelical movements were naturally also stressing things that were a bit utopistic at that time. And certain fringes of these movements were also pretty much extremely violent. And you can argue that at this point you can interpret it in this way, that since at the time everybody was Christian, you can find everything in this Christian world of one thing and its opposite, just like today we're in much more secular world, and you find still people, you still find the same criticism. Same criticism towards the wealthy, powerful guys at the top, and the violent extremism of the lower classes. or let's say the extremist fringes of the certain parts of the lower classes, and a big deal of people in the middle, like most of us, that just look at how it goes and they leave it true in some way, and maybe accomplish something more in terms of civilization in the meanwhile, and they make silently the whole thing going on from a civilization point of view. So it's really, if from this 14th century society you had taken away the Christian variable from the equation, you would see some same things, essentially. This was happening, for instance, same in the Islamic world. I mean, albeit in different ways, but it was same thing. It was same thing everywhere, actually. Naturally, of course, there were substantial differences from a cultural point of view, but the essentials of how human politics and societies work are practically always the same, because guess what? Humans are all the same. So they can be influenced by several factors, but they most of all kind of tend to do the same things at the end of the day. So sometimes by the 14th century, naturally the church had achieved a huge power. This is arguably the time. Well, actually, the Roman Church achieved its greater temporal power into the beginning, let's say the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century. It's under Innocent III that the Roman Church literally controls the whole Europe. At this time, it starts to crack a little bit, because the national monarchies kind of get stronger, so they kind of partly exploiting the same papal models begin to build certain Caesaro-Papistic models. Think about France, chiefly. That, by the way, had, as we said before, was the power was mostly involved into the also in backing Rome at this point. So at this point, the repression of the heretical movements was extremely violent, extremely effective, I would say, and there wasn't, as we'll see today, there wasn't even the need of really making the church intervene into this directly. I mean, sometimes it was enough just to ask the local lords to say, okay, we have got this problem here, why don't you take care of that? It's how essentially the Albigensian Crusade worked. Although also in here, especially from a financial point of view, a lot of the money were kind of coming from everyone. Church first, because the church at this point was enormously wealthy as well. So a first example of the kind of the brutality to which these movements were put down, and that showed the paradox also in this case of movements that were eliminated not because they had controversial theological views, but simply because they took a stand from a political and social point of view. It was probably also, by certain standards, more worrying, because definitely from a theological point of view, there was a lot of control, but the fact that eventually the church had to integrate Aristotle in her physics, it's something, metaphysics is something that kind of proves the fact that reading the Aristotle had not been possible. I mean, couldn't be stemmed, but by absorbing this, and we saw that also with the same evangelic paparistical movements, is also proof that here there was a great deal of interest for the political and social order in many ways, rather than just the strictly theological thing, because the strict beliefs at this point couldn't really be controlled. There wasn't a, I don't know, there was a control when these movements got organized into something greater than simply spiritual things. And so just think even about what was the average Christian education at this time. I mean, Europe was Christian at this time. You don't have to think that these people actually understood much of it. If you really look at, even if you read the Chronicle of Jean de Joinville, for instance, so if you look at the highest echelons of the cream of the French nobility, at the time of a king known as Saint Louis, so Louis IX of France, so in the most Catholic kingdom of the world, that is France, you realize these noblemen they were stuck to paganism in mental forms. Like, at a certain point, Jean de Joinville states something like, if God doesn't give me victory when I pray Him, what do I pray Him for? I mean, literally, this was the main conception. So you can imagine among the masses what the perception of Christianity really was. Catechism is something that also it's only from chiefly the Counter-Reformation, but really before. But I mean, indeed, the church made also a big deal of for literacy and education, which is often overlooked and forgotten. But this was done also, and especially probably because there was the realization, especially at this time, relatively early times, that the majority of people couldn't really understand much. Yeah, sure, the Bible can be read, but it's read in Latin, for instance, and that's something that, if you don't understand Latin, what's the deal, of hearing to the Bible? You're better kind of. So, and also in here, you don't have to think that the evangelic paperistical movements were anything that different from it, exactly for this reason. I mean, these weren't radically, because that during the Enlightenment, especially, these heretics of the Middle Ages have been, but also of later times, have been a kind of reinvented as sort of heroes of reason and stuff like that, of science, etc. But it's not really so. These people had a terrible scientific. They didn't have it at all, and they were sharing great part also of the most kind of repressive, when not obscure, sides of what part of the Christian beliefs were at the time. So it's not really so. It was just something that looked, in fact, beyond the same religion. It looked at really new forms of political and social organization, and not just for the church, but for the world society. Because at this point it was all one. Church and society were, everybody was Christian. Everybody went to church. Everybody thought of the world in a Christian way. So it's obvious that by giving a different interpretation of the scriptures, you are essentially saying we have to look at the world as a whole society to a certain and some of them, as we were saying before, most of these views were also quite extreme, and they were aimed at compromising the social order for how it was known, very naively, also in part. So there is a figure, however, that we are in northern Italy in the second half of the 13th century, in the beginning, the very first, up to the 14th century, let's say, in Parma, and we're talking about this figure of Gherard Segarelli or Segalelli, I don't know. In Latin, it's Gherardinus Segarellus. So this guy was essentially the founder of the so-called Apostolics. The Apostolics were Gherard was had a poor social extraction. I mean, he was born not even in Parma proper, but like in a fraction. Now I don't remember where exactly. And he was a very religious man. And he, as many young, fervent Catholics at the time, he wanted to enter to become a monk, and he asked to be admitted into the Franciscans, the Franciscan community of Parma. And by at this point in Italy, there was a lot of, and also not just in Italy, but there were lots of different, say, heterodox currents at this point that had looked at especially were concerned with the eschatological views, especially there were the Joachimites. Probably you have heard about them, from Joachim of Fiore. That was considered as he had essentially written a lot of prophecies, and he had really influenced in part. He had said very controversial things from an orthodox point of view. He really went pretty much straight. There was a lot of concern of these, and partly, if you look at these 14th century beliefs heresies, that you realize that behind them there was always this kind of influence from Joachim of Fiore. Excuse me, I drink a little bit again. So according to the Joachimite prophecies, the end of the world had to occur in 1260. So in this year there would have been the manifestation of the Spirit, and these concerned highly also all these many people, naturally, and Gherard was definitely part of them. So he decided that at this point there was the need of kind of reforming, to renovate in part the religious the mindset of the Christians at this point, so that also to save others, not just his own soul, but really there was this great push. Just imagine, I don't know, the world had to end very soon, which is not easy, which is not difficult. I mean, it's not easy, but not also difficult, paradoxically, to understand, because we kind of got close to that. I wasn't born, but like in 1983, with Abel Archer, we really came pretty close to the nuclear holocaust, and so it's not something you can't really relate to. But just think, this is probably most difficult, that you are about, that the world society has, in this point, it's not just gonna end, but it's also gonna be judged. I mean, all your family, there is an afterlife, this is the point. There is an afterlife, and this afterlife is really the moment in which there is the big judgment, a big decision, who will be saved, who won't. So it's, as I was saying before, you have to really think of how the spiritual tensions of a person living in the 13th century really could be. These emotions, these feelings, these fears and hopes, naturally, definitely permeated the world society at the time. You would be concerned. Will I ever see, I don't know, my children in the afterlife? Will I see my my wife, my parents, my friends. I mean, what is it's important also for them to live a life that can for which they will be eventually saved. So Gherardus sold his own house. He distributed all his goods to the poor, and he began to preach the necessity to renew this life of poverty and of penitence, just like the apostles of Christ had done. So at this time, Gherard's society was already permeated by, as we were saying, by this apocalyptic mysticism that had been stressed not just by Joachim of Fiore, but also by the Franciscans. Especially the spirituals had stressed this pretty much. So there was a lot of ferment that within the same mendicant orders that had been, at least for the Franciscans, that had been institutionalized by the Roman Church. So this meant that the Church was felt by some to be reformed also from the within. It was not a, knocking at the church's door and saying, "Oh, well, let's hope they hear us." No, these people were already inside the church. So this was all the more serious, naturally, from a strictly ecclesial point of view, also. And according to these people, to these evangelic pauperists, let's say, substantive like that. The life of the church had to be revolutioned by certain standards, and this was asked, however, by so many people. Really, the 13th century is a moment in Western European society where, for the first time, a freaking lot of money starts to flow into the communities. Although only in the hands of a few. The 13th century is a century into which the first real banks kind of developed at this point, or at least I made a video just a few days ago about Italian trade and banking, since we're talking about Italy once again today. That can be useful because it talks about essentially the 13th and 14th century. I don't really explain it from a strictly social point of view, but it's important to bear in mind that the 13th century is a bit the moment of passage from goods to barter. We can say from barter to money. There is it's an approximation, I know, but it's kind of a moment of great financial growth. Lots of cash, more than just natural goods, and you see it on so many levels in society. So, but this produces basically inside these cities, and especially cities like Parma that we have seen Gherard was living in. So the very wealthy mercantile republics. This evident thing that there is essentially an oligarchy that is extremely wealthy, while the rest of the population starts, especially the middle classes, starts to become always poorer and poorer. And this is due also to wars. Parma at this time, just like the old communal Italy, was involved into continuous warfare, and which was a bit war is a business. So it was a business carried out especially by these oligarchies, and the rest of the population naturally suffered pretty much of that. Not just the urban classes, but also all the peasants living in the countryside were made up excuse me, the major part of the population. And what you see here historically by all standards is that these populations start growing increasingly poor. So there were lots of masses of poor people who, by the way, especially here in Italy, gravitated naturally around the cities, because they were the areas where the wealth gravitated, so around which the wealth gravitated. So if you were broke and you had no land, you were kind of an outcast, etc. Maybe you could go back into the city and receive some leftover of the wealthiest people. So there was sometimes this very, very intense, very sharp contrast between the wealth of few and the poverty of many. And if the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements were so strong, it was also due to the approval that they had to these masses of people who had felt to be left behind, in a certain sense. And naturally, the Gospels offer lots of evidence that these outcasts are somehow those who will be more likely saved, as they are the last in society. And the prevalent idea was that everybody had to be poor, ideally speaking. You know, if you really wanted to stick to the, can't say to the Christian teaching proper, but let's say the attachment to wealth was criticized as such. Sometimes rightfully, sometimes I think as all these pauperistic movements, they always have a component of pure social envy, just like today, in my opinion. You know, it's obvious that people who don't have anything and do not have means to have anything will want to take it from someone else, also violently if there is the need. So also the sake of having a healthy, functional society passes through the legitimate intention of avoiding even such conditions to take place, because eventually extremism kind of pops out. So in short, the Gherardus' word was pretty much followed. And his apostolical movement, as it was called, was definitely had a great success. And sometimes these movements, it is paradoxical, were supported by the same oligarchs, at least by some oligarchs, like the San Vitale in Parma, who were this extremely wealthy family that thought that by supporting these movements, the San Vitale were extremely powerful. They were a knightly family. They owned houses and towers and castles and so on. So they were military retinues, etc. And they hoped by backing the Apostolics to seize the power in Parma. It was all they were concerned of, essentially. And at this time into Parma there was a very famous author called Salimbene, who was incidentally coming himself from similar experiences compared to the one of Gherardus, with the only difference that he was actually coming from a noble family, and he was also a monk, and he writes. Salimbene is famous because he wrote essentially a very famous chronicle of Parma and of the events that took place, talking also about Frederick II, etc. that, and Salimbene himself was a Joachimite, by the way. This is kind of also interesting. And he lived on for some time, enough to realize that the end of the world did not come according to the prophecies of Joachim of Fiore, who, by the way, had kind of well, maybe we don't have time now, but let's say that these were people who were capable also of criticizing and challenging their own beliefs, and this is kind of interesting. But Salimbene was a very peculiar figure, also because he was an aristocrat in origin. Also, he had abandoned all his goods, etc., but he felt still himself as reasoning, in part, like a with the pride of an aristocrat, and that he had put at the service of his spiritual experience. And Salimbene actually writes about Gherardus, and he explicitly mentions that his movement was definitely very competitive. It was something that could spread much further. However, this evidently started to bother many, kind of the elite, because these movements were also dangerous for the control, let's say, of the community. Because if these movements, these beliefs start to spread everywhere, they kind of also start having a sort of further interest. I mean, maybe seizing even the power, or in the city, or at least backing certain faction or some other. You've seen the San Vitale were. So by 1286 there were a lot of how do I say that? Of measures who were taken against the Apostolics, and they began to the Apostolics began to be expelled. And in fact, the same Gherardus was expelled by the diocese of Parma, and after some years, he was finally arrested and burnt alive as a recidivist heretic on July the 18th, 1300. So also in here, it's important to stress there wasn't a big deal over heterodox thinking, but it was just a scandal that such preaching had contained, that for the community, in terms of political and social of criticism towards the elites, the society, etc., that brought to the violent repression. So a strict, say, continuer, we can say, of Gherardus Segarellus was the friar Dulcinus. So this figure is probably all more famous than it's been. Also, there's a big deal of hinting to it, of references to it in Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, and it's undoubtedly a very fascinating movement. Also a very mysterious one, as we were saying before, because we don't clearly understand what it really was about in the end, and how many implications it had. So the greatest thing about so what was Dolcinus and the Dulcinians? Well, Dolcinus was a friar that was at the head of the sept of the Apostolics. So he was essentially a follower of Gherardus, Segarellus, just after his death in practice. So Dolcinus was from a place called Ossola. It is also in the northwest of Italy. It's important here, the geographical dimension, because at the north of Italy, just like the Rhone Valley, etc., had been a region of great spread of the evangelic Pauperistical movements. So it's very interesting to see how these movements spread also in the wealthiest areas of Europe at the time, in the urban classes, as we've seen also with the Apostolics. So he was born like in the mid of the 13th century, we don't know really when, and basically he continued like the apostolical movement, obtaining a great deal of followers that even took arms against bishops when they were started being persecuted. This happened in the cities of Novara and Vercelli. And in 1306, a crusade was launched against him by Pope Clement V, and this obliged Dolcinus and his followers to take refuge in the nearby mountains in the Alps. So in spite of the initial success, basically this apostolical army was destroyed by the Crusaders, and Dolcinus was taken himself and burnt on the stake in 1307. And this figure is very important. It actually made a lot of impression at the time. A lot of great authors talk about him, like Dante or Villani. Although they tell us a very few, they sometimes, from the way they describe him and things they write, really make us understand that this figure was something, say, greater than just a simple heretic. He was he resisted in arms. We've seen it now. So he was something that he did something that was relatively very that really went beyond the strictly doctrinal point of view. And it seems that this movement had much more markedly political characters than others. Dolcinus was also taken as a sort of hero of the situation, like this desperate, revolutionary in many ways. It's as if, also in here, like at these times, we have myths like, I don't know, the Guevara and these figures that kind of were mythicized in pop culture for some reason. At the time, it was really like that in part. That these even these kind of bad guys, because they were recognized as heretics, they and therefore they were negatively perceived. Were also kind of suscitated some form of admiration, especially the way they fought and died. So Dolcinus had also this military, stigma attached, and which naturally had made the whole thing worse, because this was not just imagine it from how easy it was to condemn someone who not just preached something heterodox, but also about which we don't know much, by the way, but also took arms. And that's why before I was stressing so much the political and military role now of these movements, rather than strictly religious meaning they had. So at this point, naturally, it was also the official, continuator of Gherardus' work. So he was at the head of a movement whose leader had been burned as an heretic, and this was naturally showing the resilience of such movement, and made the repression increasingly stronger. This figure was, however, so famous it was even some kind of depicted in some kind of chivalrous fashion. Now, I don't want to exaggerate, but if you really read the sources about him, you realize there is even some really some admiration of his adventures and kind of heroic stand in many ways. So the greatest persecutor of Dulcinus was the Dominican Bernard Guy. So naturally we know most of what he preached through this source that naturally is biased, but every source is biased at the time, so it's still kind of important. And what it expressed were certain rules of behavior, substantially, that however directly challenged the church as a medium between God and the Christians, and attacked basically everybody, from the Papacy to the same mendicant orders that were deemed to have, in this sense, betrayed the original evangelical message and having kind of bowed to the papal monarchy. So there are certain letters, especially, that have survived. I think there are like 3 letters. At least the ones about whose contents we actually know. The name of the Dulcinians at this point was not just the Apostolics, but the True Church of Christ. It's also, the name is pretty meaningful in terms of the contents, and it has a very radical and kind of also bold resounding name. Here we are the True Church of Christ, so all the others are not, essentially, at least the ones that claim to be, and that oppose us. So he also made a sort of deal foreseeing what the fate of Christianity would have been, of Christianity meant as the community of the Christians. In the first letter, Dulcinus enumerates certain revelations that he allegedly had, and he actually deplores the persecution of the clergy. And from these letters, we understood that he was pretty much soaked into Joachimism, as he starts telling about these ages of these phases into which Christianity was split. The first one was the epoch of the Father, corresponded to the Old Testament. The second was, and into which marriage was substantially a good thing to do and was fine. The second epoch was the one of salvation, carried out by Christ and continued by his followers, into which virginity instead had a greater value than marriage. The third epoch instead was the epoch of the degeneration, and this had occurred essentially between at the time of Pope Sylvester and Emperor Constantine. So this was a typical way of conceiving time from a Christian point of view, so a linear time of decline. The Christians at this time believed in general, that the world was kind of going always worse by regularly. Let's say that everything would have got always worse, because at the end of times, at the end the devil would have arrived on earth, and then at the end of times, God would have arrived and judged. But let's say there was a progressive aging of time. This was how it was conceived. So everything that went. This is something also that you hear today. How this is kind of normal in every age. In every age, people said, "Oh well, we are going always. This is going to be always worse." Well, it seems things have gone always better. I mean, looking, at least there is nothing teleological into it, but I'm personally happier to live in 2019 than in 1319, let's say. So things haven't really got so worse ever since. At least I believe. That you can speculate philosophically how this is really true or not, but so to these progressive also decline of the faith and charity, because this is also what Dulcinus was definitely looking at. To him and his followers, it was evident that the corruption of the church definitely corresponded to also loss of general interest for faith and charity from everybody, actually, not just from the church as from the church broadly meant, so all the community of the faithful. So it was everybody's fault in some measure, and this is why these Dulcinians were stressing so much that their role of true Christians, because they had figured it out. It wasn't like that, and things had to go. So there had been figures, however, humanity was still living according to this time division into the age of to the epoch of the generation. And there had been, however, certain heroes of Christian heroes like Saint Benedict, Saint Francis. This is important because it was an implicit criticism. You see, the Dulcinians were critical also towards the Franciscans, because they had kind of betrayed Saint Francis' rule, according to him. This is partly true, by the way, because that's why there was still this fringe of the spirituals among the Franciscans that was creating problem, because they didn't want to settle down and to become essentially that copy of the Dominicans that the Pope had essentially shaped them like. And Saint Dominic also was, however, taken. So it's fascinating to see how the Dulcinians were looking at the founders of the mendicant orders and really saying, okay, that original guidance was correct. Then even these movements have kind of lost themselves along the way. And in this timeline, eventually God, according to the Dulcinians, God had sent had begun a fourth epoch that would have to be the one of the renewal of the apostolic life of the church, by sending Gherardus, Segarellus. So think also about the messianic meanings in which these Gherardus and the Apostolics were loaded of. This was the beginning of another epoch. Now, most of us today don't even know who Gherardus Segarellus was, and at that time he was conceived by the Apostolics. Definitely a guy who had come to be really the same level of figures like Christ, and substantially, and you can understand what's the heresy behind the thing, but it's still important because it stresses how deeply these movements had really made their own the concept of radicalism for the change of society. I mean, they had kind of understood that certain figures in the past had been kind of revolutionary, like Christ. So it didn't seem at all strange that an humble person like these, like Gherardus or Dulcinus, could have instead such a huge role into the history of Christianity. And this was a bit what it was all about. I mean, these were poor people. They weren't anything like these powerful, rich clergymen, bishops that ruled the cities, and they saw every day wearing extremely expensive clothes and living in luxury, etc. These were the poor, and the poor were the ones who were to be saved, and to offer a model, a Christ-like model, to be follow. So, and the end of the world was near, because this fourth epoch would have basically concluded shortly, in short, and the judgments they would have come. So it was a kind of a last chance at this point to renew the church and to really make to save the world in part from itself. So these are views that you find also in other, many other movements, but other contents in Dulcinus' letters express, even through prophecies, a much deeper and kind of singular political aim. Dulcinus, in fact, announced that in a few years, 3 years, the king of Sicily, Frederick of Aragon, would have been elected emperor, and he would have created new kings, and he would have fought against Boniface VIII, which would have been killed by Frederick. Now this is very important because if you have more or less a picture of what the political background of this really was, I mean, the kingdom of Sicily, Sicily had been seized by the Aragonese at this point, and the Aragonese were allies with the Ghibellines. This is what is really serious, and so the Aragonese were allied with the Germans, with the Italian Ghibellines, etc. The Pope at this point was allied instead with the Angevins of Naples, with the Guelphs of Italy, with the Kingdom of France, although so, because Boniface VIII would have eventually quarreled pretty intensely against the French king, but for in this sense, ideological matters, but the axis, France Papacy was not to be broken at all, and on the long run, because there was no strategic reason for that. So the idea of looking at Frederick of Aragon is pretty singular by certain standards. At this point, it was the Habsburgs were kind of I don't remember who was emperor at this time, because we are in I don't remember neither which year this is really this was the year 1300. So by the year 1300, I think it was still the Habsburgs who were because Henry VII came later. So let's give a look. These weren't really, I think they were just even only kings of the Romans. So by this time, who was? Okay, so these were king of the Romans. Still kings of the Romans, in fact. I wouldn't like to be wrong, but I think it was still Albert of Habsburg in this time. Yeah, in fact, this time it was Albert of Habsburg who died in 1308, and eventually Henry VII rose, Henry of Luxembourg. So this is important because the Habsburgs at this point were not really intervening much into Italian affairs. So looking at Frederick of Aragon was kind of saying, okay, someone who is more directly involved at this time. The Aragonese were harshly fighting against the Angevins, etc. So even this idea of Dulcinus that Frederick of Aragon would have been named emperor is interesting, and that he would have replaced all the kings. So really changing everything. So sometimes these movements needed to really stress to stress, I don't know, this new paladin of faith would arrive, would change everything, and so changing all the monarchs, so changing theoretically everything that followed, because this is interesting because it still supports the hierarchy in many ways. It doesn't say he will take out all the kings and I don't know, the Apostolics will rule. No, the kings have to be there. So this is important because it tells you how certain models, certain social systems were, political systems were so deeply natural, were so deeply absorbed and interiorized at the time that it couldn't be even put into discussion. This is very political as well, and especially what is alarming, it says that Boniface VIII would have been slaughtered by Frederick of Aragon. So it's kind of, naturally it's pure fantasy, but it's still fascinating because it has an extremely violent meaning attached to it, and everybody who was claiming the Pope would have been rightfully exterminated naturally couldn't really go pretty much on. But what is more subtle in this is that this is not even pure utopia, because this meant that Dolcinus was actually allied with the Ghibelline powers. This is the point. When Dolcinus took arms against the church, and this is actually correct because the church had armies at that time were fighting also. The Crusader army that was sent against him was, in this sense, the army of the church. It was normal to have the church had an army at the time. As it kind of still has today, very small part, but still has. You know that the Swiss halberdiers are just parade equipment in the Vatican. There is an arsenal full of the most up-to-date assault rifles and rocket launchers, grenades. It's still there. There is an arsenal in the Vatican as well. So this was important because he was connected with the Ghibelline party at this point. So Italy was kind of split in two at this time. The Guelphs were still kind of hegemonic at this point after the fall of the Hohenstaufen, but there were still Ghibelline powers that were struggling against the Papal French push. But more in general, the local Guelph Italian cities. So in this situation, there were evidently, so certain reactions that came also towards this hegemony, because it was perceived how powerful the Papal Angevin bloc had gone. So it wasn't. That's why I stress it was not just a religious thing, because it was at this time there were certain political and military events that were showing an extremely warring reality, especially for certain communities. The Germans at this time were very weak. As we've said, the Habsburgs were not coming from beyond across the Alps. Yeah, they were still interacting with Italy and with the Italian Ghibellines, which always happened, but their power was too weak. It's not before Henry VII of Luxembourg that arrived once again into Italy that the Ghibellines are managed basically to recompact the whole Po Valley against chiefly a Tuscan Guelphism. Although, yeah, it's a bit more complicated than this, but that made a difference. So this shout out of Dulcinus in his letters is very meaningful, because he's aggressively criticizing not just the papacy but also the whole Guelph bloc, by saying that would have been destroyed essentially by Aragon, so the Ghibellines at the time, and the empire, because we've seen now the Frederick of Aragon would have had to be crowned emperor according to the prophecy. So at this point, once Frederick would be crowned, what would happen according to Dolcinus? Well, in the letters continue to say that at this point there would have been a new pope that would have not been elected by the cardinals, but sent by God. So this is kind of interesting, because also Gherardus, for instance, had been sent by God. So we don't know what Dulcinus' ambitions really were. Pretty utopistic, but also pretty interesting in political theory. And naturally, the apostolic orders will help the Pope to make the Spirit of God triumphing, and until the Antichrist would have not come, and then this, because this had to happen, by the way, before the coming of the kingdom of heaven on earth. And however, this had to happen in 3 years, and after 3 years none of this happened naturally. And so Dulcinus wrote kind of another letter saying, oh well, no, yeah, it will happen soon, so don't worry about that. Yeah, guess how it ended? We already said that actually he was burnt at the stake, actually 4 years later, after having defeated, and by this time, however, you have to think that the Dulcinians actually gathered a very vast number of followers between the regions of Lombardy, Emilia, and the Trent region. So for 4 years, actually, the Dulcinians resisted to the papal forces. It was not a few, and you can argue that this was not just a bunch of weak, scattered people just preaching. They were actually pretty organized group. They surely had sympathizers among many powerful people. Surely certain cities also helped them. And they eventually, as we said, were defeated, and his Dulcinus' death was kind of naturally perceived like the one of a martyr.
the one who kind of did something greater than the usual. Also because at this time you have to think that whoever took arms was seen always in a sort of, even Christianly speaking, in a sort of as we were saying before, according to the Gospels, those who bear the swords do not do it in vain. So they can even be heretics, but the fact that they had managed to even to face an ecclesiastical army for years, well, it's not something. It was something resounding, indeed. And Dolcinus stood. I mean, even when he was defeated and captured, he kind of said, "Okay, I don't give up my faith. I don't renounce to it. I don't." Well, at that point, there was nothing he really could do to save his own life. So, he decided not to repudiate his beliefs, because at that point he would have been killed anyway. So with the Dulcinians, the Dulcinians were destroyed, as we have seen, but their more authentic and rigorous religious instances were to live on. And this is framed in a broader phenomenon, historical phenomenon, that is essentially all that has to deal with all these kind of hidden tracks that survived in parallel with the and radically with radically different beliefs to the ones of the official Church of Rome, that were about to re-emerge from time to time. And especially during the 14th and 15th century, every once in a while these movements took a very explicit meaning of social revolt. I mean, the idea, for instance, of not paying the tithes to the church, something that was naturally very appealing for many workers and poor people. And also in here, just like today, you don't have to think that, there are lots of people who don't want to pay taxes and take very they build this kind of political theory and the ideology revolving around it, and but if you really look at the interests, are always kind of the same, and they are legitimate. Actually, I don't think I'm not criticizing them at this point, because I am also critical about at least certain, not about taxation in itself, but naturally what, I guess, like everybody, what you do, what the state does with those taxes, and how you. So I think we all have this kind of rebellious nature within ourselves, also because society is definitely something artificial, at least in the way we have created it historically, because we are meant to live like hunter-gatherers, if you really want to, and probably not even that if you really go at the origins. So the problem of humans is that we developed our nervous system, like our cerebral capacities evolved much faster than what the rest of our body actually could adapt to. So there can't be any perfect society, simply because society as we know it is something artificial, or at least it doesn't fit with our biological structure. They cannot at least perfectly fit with our biological structure, and that's why especially I must say humans are pretty they're being social animals. Actually they can adapt pretty well, and also our mind does, but it's obvious that when there is a situation in which you have really no other option, and you do rebel, and this is something you can see throughout all history. I mean, at one point, if the option is starving to death and to, seizing, stealing something from someone else, and maybe even killing that person, what will you do? Because this is actually how not just this doesn't happen just at a small level, but it's a bit like how the same conflictual nature of human beings, like the same war is nothing but a duel on a large scale, and the reasons for that duel can be very trivial as well. And very often, now we don't get it too philosophical, but what I'm trying to say here is that, at least from a historical point of view, the Church of Rome kind of it managed to repress these movements, but at the same time couldn't extirpate them. This is natural, as we were saying before, because we are in the Middle Ages. We don't have means of controlling people's minds effectively. We're not in 20th century totalitarianisms with industrial societies and states that can really impose something strictly and not letting anyone escape. And also in there, so think about the Middle Ages. Yeah, there was this kind of a social order, but it could be broken. And events like these of the Dulcinians actually proved that. These guys could create an army on their own and go around and cause problems, facing other more trained armies. So it's something naturally very serious also for the people who lived in these areas, as you have to imagine that these Dulcinians were also, robbing and exterminating and raping and doing the worst things, like all the bands of brigands that existed out there. Many people joined them just for the sake of pillaging, and that's it. They probably didn't even care about what Dulcinus was thinking, or at least maybe they were exalted by it, but at the end of the day all they cared about was naturally loot and prey and so on, and which was, by the way, pretty average at that time, as there was a lot of this form of criminality, and the same war, for how it happened, was also an activity that was carried out also for the sake of loot and booty and stuff like that. So it's very bitter as a consideration, and as it would be much easier to make a poetic depiction of such movements, but we have to stay objective as well. And if you look at it in an historical perspective, however, you realize that eventually with the Reformation in the 16th century, you can argue that was kind of the moral redemption of these movements of the past. Because if you take Luther, well, what was it? He was essentially denying the papal power, and he was dealing with problems that, by the way, were the same that in parts had been not settled in the past. The problem of grace and salvation is something that, especially Augustine, and naturally Luther was very influenced chiefly by St. Paul's and St. Augustine. They were the ones that indeed had been saying very subtle things relatively to the problem of grace and salvation, that indeed up to the Renaissance and at this point nobody had really the courage of the possibility or the chance eventually to debate thoroughly, and as this is what originally Luther was really asking for. Yes, there was a lot more to that. You have to understand it not just under a strictly religious point of view, but it's it was after all something could have been handled differently, and that the Roman Church kind of ignored. Just like with Luther, the Pope kind of underestimated what was happening in Germany there. So it's at this point it's kind of a good historical lesson, because it proves how the Roman Church had been grown confident over the centuries, after especially having crushed these movements back in the day, and however not completely managing to extinguish the problems that were inherent to the interpretation of the scriptures, and that had at a certain point had to pop out. So we haven't really been talking about the Reformation, as I haven't been talking much about modern history in here. I don't know if I should extend to that, but it's very important to see how certain problems were always there in different forms, in different manifestations, but ultimately from the same exact words of the scriptures of the fathers of the church throughout old Christian history, and how the evangelical Pauperistic movements were after all nothing but always the same thing, questioned over and over again. I mean, is there to be a medium between God and mankind? And what are the prerogatives of this medium? What about the fitness of the clergyman? What about... these are things that were discussed over and over again. However, for now, I just stop in here, and I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.